March 11th, 1943, mid-Atlantic. 47 degreean, 29 degree Wolfers. The ocean was black ink beneath a starless sky. U-606 rolled gently in the swell, her diesel engine silent, her electric motors humming like a nervous heartbeat in the cold belly of the deep. Kapitän Lieutenant Hans Joachim Doehler stood in the conning tower, salt spray freezing on his beard, his Zeiss binoculars scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of a merchant convoy. The air smelled of fuel oil and wet steel. Below him, 47 men breathed recycled air, ate moldy bread, and waited. They had been waiting for 3 days. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. Then from the east, a sound, not the deep throb of a cargo ship's engine, not the high whine of a destroyer's turbines. Something new, something that made Doehler's stomach tighten. A steady rhythmic drone, aircraft engines, multiple, circling, and beneath it, the faint ping of active sonar, probing the thermoclines, searching. Doehler's executive officer climbed into the tower, his face pale in the darkness. "Herr Kalu," he whispered, "they're not escorting anymore. They're hunting us now." Doehler nodded slowly. He had heard the rumors in Lorient, in the smoke-filled rooms where U-boat commanders traded stories over schnapps and cigarettes. The Americans had changed the game. They were no longer content to defend their convoys with a thin screen of destroyers. They had built something new, floating air bases, small carriers that carried nothing but aircraft and escorts whose sole purpose was not to protect merchantmen, but to kill submarines. Hunter-killer groups. The phrase sounded almost biblical in its finality. U-606 crash dove. The klaxon shrieked. Men tumbled through hatches. The sea closed over them like a fist. And in that moment, as the pressure hull groaned and the depth gauge needles spun downward, the psychological balance of the Battle of the Atlantic, 3 years of tonnage warfare, convoy battles, and wolfpack tactics shifted irrevocably. The hunters had become the hunted. To understand the terror that gripped U-boat commanders in the spring and summer of 1943, one must first understand what the U-boat war had been. For nearly 4 years, Germany's submarine fleet had waged a campaign of industrial strangulation against Great Britain and her allies. The arithmetic was brutally simple: sink merchant tonnage faster than the Allies could replace it, and Britain would starve, her armies would wither, and the war would be won without ever setting foot on English soil. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, calculated that sinking 700,000 tons per month would achieve this goal. In November 1942, his Wolfpack sank 729,000 tons. The Atlantic was a graveyard of broken hulls and drowning men, and the U-boat crews were its reapers. But the U-boat war had always been a war of attrition on both sides. Submarines were fragile things, blind and slow beneath the surface, vulnerable when forced to dive. The introduction of airborne radar in 1941 and 1942 had begun to erode the U-boat's greatest advantage: the ability to attack unseen on the surface at night. British and Canadian long-range patrol aircraft, Liberators, Sunderlands, Catalinas, closed the mid-Atlantic gap, the Black Pit, where convoys had once sailed beyond the reach of land-based air cover. U-boat losses rose. Dönitz demanded more boats, better torpedoes, schnorkels, acoustic homing torpedoes. The technological race accelerated. But technology was not the Americans' answer. Their answer was simpler, more fundamental, more devastating. They built carriers, lots of them. Not the massive fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown, whose aircraft struck at enemy fleets across the Pacific. These were smaller, cheaper, and faster to produce. Escort carriers, or baby flat tops, converted from merchant hulls or built on simple standardized designs. USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Core, USS Santee. Each carried 20 to 30 aircraft, Grumman Wildcats and Avengers, and each was paired with a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. These task groups had one mission: find U-boats and kill them. The first hunter-killer group, built around USS Bogue, sailed in March 1943. Within 6 weeks, Bogue's aircraft had sunk their first U-boat. By May, the groups were multiplying. By June, the Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground for wolf packs. It was a killing field for submarines. The U-boat men had expected many things when they volunteered for the Unterseebootwaffe. They expected danger. Submarine service was never safe. They expected discomfort, weeks at sea in a steel tube, cramped bunks stacked 3 high, the constant reek of sweat and diesel and bilge water. They expected glory, Dönitz promised, them status medals, the adoration of the Reich. The aces, men like Günther Prien and Otto Kretschmer, were celebrities, their faces on recruiting posters, their tonnage totals broadcast on radio. A U-boat captain who sank 100,000 tons received the Knight's Cross. Sink more, and you might earn the oak leaves, the swords, the diamonds. Dönitz called them the wolves. The propaganda machine called them heroes. What they did not expect was to become prey. Korvettenkapitan Peter Dönitz, no relation to the Grand Admiral, commanded U-954 in the spring of 1943. His war diary, recovered from German archives decades later, records the psychological shift with clinical precision. March 15th. Sighted convoy HX-229 preparing attack. March 17th. Aircraft force dive, attack aborted. March 20th. Aircraft contact, force deep, depth charges, minor damage. March 25th. Aircraft again, cannot surface safely, batteries low. April 2nd. Returning to base, mission failure, morale poor. On May 19th, 1943, U-954 was sunk by aircraft from USS Bogue. There were no survivors. The testimony of those who did survive other attacks paints a picture of mounting dread. Oberleutnant Zurzay, Erich Topp, one of the few aces to survive the war, described the hunter-killer groups in his post-war memoir. It was not like fighting a convoy. With a convoy, you knew where the escorts were. You could maneuver, wait, strike when conditions were favorable. But these American groups, they had no convoy to defend. They had only us to hunt. Their aircraft circled endlessly. Their destroyers followed every contact. If you surfaced to charge batteries, they found you. If you stayed deep, your batteries died, and you had no choice but to surface into their guns. It was not war. It was systematic extermination. The statistics bear him out. In May 1943, 41 U-boats were lost, nearly 1 per day. This was more than the total number lost in any previous month of the entire war. Dönitz faced, with casualty rates approaching 30%, made the unprecedented decision to withdraw all U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. For the first time since 1939, the wolf packs retreated. The hunter-killer groups operated on principles that were revolutionary in anti-submarine warfare. Traditional convoy escorts were defensive by nature. Their mission was to protect merchantmen, not to pursue attackers. If a U-boat was detected, escorts would counterattack, but their primary duty kept them tethered to the convoy. U-boats exploited this. A wolf pack could shadow a convoy for days, probing defenses, waiting for the moment when weather, darkness, or distraction allowed an attack. Even if depth-charged and forced to break off, a U-boat could often escape in the vastness of the ocean. Hunter-killer groups inverted this dynamic. They were offensive weapons. Freed from the constraints of convoy defense, they could pursue a contact for hours, even days. The escort carrier provided persistent air coverage. Aircraft relieved each other in rotation, maintaining a continuous search pattern over hundreds of square miles. When a U-boat was detected, either by radar, sonar, or visual sighting, the group converged. Aircraft attacked with depth bombs and homing torpedoes. Destroyers closed in with sonar and depth charge racks. The U-boat, if it survived the initial attack, faced a grim calculus: stay submerged and exhaust batteries, or surface and face aircraft and gunfire. Captain Daniel Gallery, commander of the hunter-killer group built around USS Guadalcanal, described the tactical advantage in a 1944 interview. A submarine is blind underwater. It can't see, can't hear much beyond its own noise, can't move fast. Our aircraft are its eyes' nightmare. They see everything. The moment a U-boat breaks surface, we have it. And if it stays down, we wait. We can wait longer than its batteries can. Gallery's group achieved the war's most spectacular anti-submarine success. In June 1944, when they captured U-505 intact, the only German submarine boarded and captured on the high seas during the war. But Guadalcanal's group was just one of many. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy was operating a dozen hunter-killer groups simultaneously. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy, inspired by American success, formed their own. The technological components were not individually revolutionary. Escort carriers were slow, lightly armed, and vulnerable to enemy action. Several were torpedoed and sunk by U-boats during the war. The aircraft they carried, Wildcats and Avengers, were reliable but not cutting edge. Radar was improving but still limited in range and resolution. Sonar remained imperfect, plagued by thermal layers and false contacts. What was revolutionary was the integration. The hunter-killer group functioned as a single organism. Aircraft extended the group's sensors across the horizon. Surface ships brought weapons to bear. The carrier coordinated everything. Information flowed constantly. A radar contact was handed off to an aircraft. An aircraft sighting guided destroyers. A sonar contact summoned more aircraft. The U-boat, accustomed to fighting isolated duels, faced a networked enemy. And the Americans kept building more carriers. The psychological impact on U-boat crews cannot be overstated. Submarine warfare had always required a peculiar kind of courage, the willingness to descend into a steel coffin and trust your life to machinery, to the skill of your commander, to the silence of the ocean. U-boat men cultivated a grim stoicism. They sang songs about death and the sea. They painted kill markers on their conning towers and grew beards and wore their white-topped caps at jaunty angles. But stoicism requires a belief that courage and skill matter, that your actions influence your fate. The hunter-killer group stripped that belief away. It didn't matter if you were a veteran crew with a dozen patrols under your belt or a raw crew on your first mission. It didn't matter if your captain was cautious or aggressive. If an American escort carrier found your patrol area, your odds of survival plummeted. The diary of Werner Henke, commander of U-515 and holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, reveals the erosion of morale. April 9th, 1944. The men are silent. They do their duties, but the laughter is gone. Ernst asked me today if we would make it home. I told him yes, of course, but I don't know if I believe it anymore. The Americans are everywhere. Their aircraft, their ships, they are like a net tightening. Every day we survive feels like borrowed time. Henke's U-515 was sunk by destroyers from the USS Guadalcanal Group on April 9th, 1944. The day after that diary entry, Henke survived, was taken prisoner, and later shot while allegedly attempting escape at a POW camp in Tennessee. 16 of his crew survived the sinking. 43 did not. The younger crewmen, those who joined in 1943 and 1944, had it worst. They had been recruited with promises of glory and posters showing U-boat aces in crisp uniforms, receiving medals from Hitler himself. They arrived at training bases and found exhausted instructors and obsolete equipment. They joined operational boats and found hollow-eyed veterans who drank too much and spoke in whispers about the baby flat tops and the devil birds. On patrol, they learned that the ocean was no longer an ally concealing them from the enemy, but a trap from which there was no escape. Hans-Georg Hess, a radio operator on U-66, survived the war and testified in a 1960s oral history project. We stopped believing in victory. That happened slowly, boat by boat, patrol by patrol. You would return to Lorient or Bergen and see which boats had not returned, the empty pens, the silence. Then you heard how they died, surprised on the surface by aircraft, hunted for 30 hours until their batteries died, blown apart by a depth charge pattern that collapsed the pressure hull, and you knew that next patrol, it might be you. We stopped believing in victory. We started believing only in the next minute, the next hour. If we made it through one more watch without the alarm bell, that was enough. By 1944, U-boat crews referred to their vessels as iron coffins. The term was not new. It dated back to World War I, but it took on fresh, bitter meaning. Casualty rates climbed above 70%. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served on U-boats during the war, 28,000 died and 5,000 were captured. The U-boat service suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German military, higher than the Waffenseil. higher than the infantry divisions that bled out at Stalingrad and Normandy. And still, the escorts carriers came. There was a symbolic quality to the hunter-killer groups that transcended mere tactics. The escort carriers themselves embodied American industrial might in its purest, most overwhelming form. They were cheap, roughly 1/10 the cost of a fleet carrier. They were fast to build. Some took less than 4 months from keel laying to commissioning. They were numerous. By war's end, over 120 escort carriers had been built or converted, many serving in the Atlantic. To the U-boat men, struggling with shortages of torpedoes, fuel, spare parts, and even food, the seemingly endless procession of American carriers was demoralizing proof that they faced an enemy with functionally unlimited resources. German war production, despite Albert Speer's best efforts, could not keep pace. Yards in Hamburg and Kiel built U-boats as fast as they could, but the Allies sank them faster. New models with better technology, the Type 41 and Type 43, with streamlined hulls and greater underwater speed, arrived too late and in too few numbers. The Americans, meanwhile, built carriers on assembly lines. This contrast, scarcity versus abundance, attrition versus production, became the defining reality of the Atlantic War's final years. U-boat crews ate preserved foods that tasted of tin and decay. American sailors on escort carriers ate fresh-baked bread, ice cream made in the ship's galley, turkey dinners at Thanksgiving. U-boat crews patched worn uniforms and repaired failing machinery with improvised tools. American supply ships brought spare parts, new aircraft, fresh crews. When an American escort carrier was damaged or sunk, another took its place within weeks. When a U-boat was lost, its crew was gone forever. Irreplaceable experience and training vanished into the Atlantic. The Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine, had a maximum submerged speed of about 8 knots and could remain underwater for perhaps 24 hours before batteries demanded surfacing. A Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber from an escort carrier could cruise at 150 knots and search for 8 hours without refueling. The mathematics were brutal. The ocean, which once seemed vast enough to hide in, shrank to a grid of overlapping patrol sectors, each covered by aircraft that never seemed to stop searching. Captain Lieutenant Johann Mohr, another of the early aces, reportedly told a fellow commander in late 1942, "The ocean used to be our friend, now it feels like a bathtub, and the Americans are holding us under." Mohr died in April 1943 when U-124 was sunk by a corvette and a destroyer. No hunter-killer group, just conventional escorts. But his metaphor endured. The ocean had shrunk. The wolves were drowning. There is a particular audio recording, archived at the Imperial War Museum in London, that captures the final moments of U-763 as recorded by sonar operators aboard the USS Mission Bay hunter-killer group in September 1944. The U-boat had been detected by radar while surfacing to recharge batteries. Aircraft attacked within minutes. Forced to dive, U-763 attempted to evade, but the destroyer escort USS Fessenden gained sonar contact and prosecuted a textbook attack. The recording is scratchy, distorted by water and distance, but distinct. First, the ping of active sonar, steady, mechanical, relentless. Then, the muffled crack of depth charges, a rolling thunder that sounds almost musical through the hydrophone. A pause, and then, faintly, a sound like tearing metal and the rush of water under immense pressure. A sound that lasts 3 seconds. Then silence. 48 men died in those 3 seconds. The sonar operator's voice comes through, tinny on the old recording. Target destroyed, breaking up noises, no further contact. In the background, someone says, "Mark the position. Let's go find another one." This was the new rhythm of the Atlantic War, methodical, industrial, impersonal. The U-boats were no longer feared predators, but targets in a production line of destruction. The hunter-killer groups processed them with assembly line efficiency: detect, attack, confirm, move on. There was no hatred in it, no revenge, just the steady application of overwhelming force. German submariners, who had once seen themselves as an elite, as the tip of the spear, as warriors in a heroic struggle, confronted the reality that they had become materiel, inputs in an attrition equation they could not win. The The psychological shift was profound. Glory became survival. Heroism became simply making it home. And increasingly, they didn't. The turning point was not a single battle, but an accumulation of losses across May, June, and July of 1943. Historians call it Black May, the month when Dönitz lost 41 boats and pulled the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. But the withdrawal did not end the slaughter. U-boats reassigned to other areas, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, discovered that hunter-killer groups were being deployed there too. The Americans built carriers faster than Germany built submarines. By the autumn of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over as a contest for control of sea lanes. Convoys still faced danger. Individual U-boats still scored kills, but the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. The Allies no longer feared that Britain would be starved into submission. The flow of supplies, troops, and equipment from America to Britain accelerated, building the immense stockpile that would make D-Day possible. Yet the U-boats kept sailing. Dönitz, ever loyal, ever optimistic in public, insisted that new technologies would restore the balance. Acoustic torpedoes, radar detectors, schnorkels, higher submerged speeds. Each innovation promised salvation. Crews were told that the tide would turn, that victory was still possible, that their sacrifices mattered. But in the privacy of their quarters, in the long silences between patrols, the U-boat men knew better. They read the casualty lists, they counted the empty bunks, they calculated the odds. Herbert Werner, author of the post-war memoir Iron Coffins, wrote, "We were dead men on leave. Every patrol was a death sentence postponed. We drank because drinking made us forget. We sang because singing drowned out the voice that told us we would not grow old. And when we sailed, we did so not because we believed in victory, but because refusal meant the firing squad. We were trapped between the depths and the bullets, and either way, we drowned." This was the final cruelty of the hunter-killer groups. They did not grant the dignity of a fair fight. They simply erased you, efficiently and without drama. There were no epic duels, no last stands, no chances to die heroically defending the fatherland. Just the sudden appearance of an aircraft, the klaxon, the rush to dive, and then, if you were unlucky, the depth charges and the darkness and the water. Among the hunter-killer group commanders, a certain ethos developed. They were not, by and large, men who reveled in killing. They were professionals executing a mission. Captain Gallery kept a baseball in his pocket and talked about the Chicago Cubs. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger of the destroyer USS Fletcher wrote letters to his wife about his daughter's piano lessons. These were not Nazis and Allies locked in ideological combat. They were technicians of war, and the U-boats were their problem set. But there was also a recognition among Allied sailors that the men they hunted were not monsters. U-boat crews had, in the early years of the war, generally adhered to the customs of sea warfare. They allowed lifeboats to escape, sometimes provided coordinates for rescue, refrained from machine-gunning survivors. The 1942 Laconia incident, where a U-boat attempting to rescue survivors was attacked by an American bomber, hardened attitudes on both sides. Dönitz issued the Laconia Order, forbidding rescue attempts. The war at sea grew darker. Still, when survivors were fished from the water, they were often treated with a certain respect. Gallery, after capturing U-505, ensured the crew was treated well and later corresponded with some of them after the war. American and British sailors recognized that submarine duty was a special kind of hell, regardless of which flag you served. The ocean was the true enemy. The rest was just the machinery of politics and nations. There is a photograph taken aboard USS Escort in 1943 that has become iconic. It shows a young German submariner, perhaps 20 years old, sitting wrapped in a blanket, hands around a mug of coffee. His face is blank, eyes unfocused, the expression of someone whose mind is still underwater. Behind him, an American sailor stands casually, holding a rifle, but his posture is relaxed, almost bored. There is no drama in the image, just exhaustion. The caption, written by a Navy photographer, reads, "Survivor of U-664, picked up after 8 hours in the water. He asked for bread. Bread, not defiance, not ideology, just bread." By 1945, the U-boat war had become a futile exercise in delayed defeat. The Type 25 boats, with their revolutionary design, could have changed the equation, faster underwater than most escorts on the surface, capable of remaining submerged for days. But only a handful became operational before the war ended, and by then, the Allies controlled the seas so completely that even a wonder weapon could not have mattered. Germany was collapsing, the Atlantic routes were secure, the invasion fleets had crossed and returned unopened. On May 4, 1945, Dönitz, now Führer of a non-existent Reich following Hitler's suicide, ordered all U-boats to cease operations and surrender. Some obeyed. Some scuttled their boats rather than hand them over. A few in distant waters learned of the surrender weeks late and surfaced to find the war over. The final tally was grim. Germany built 1,262 U-boats during the war. 784 were lost. 28,000 submariners died. They sank 2,179 Allied merchant ships and 175 warships, a staggering toll. But they lost. They lost because the Allies, and especially the Americans, could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. They lost because the escort carriers and hunter-killer groups turned the ocean from a concealing vastness into a killing grid. They lost because courage and skill, in the end, could not overcome mathematics. There is a monument in Miltenort, Germany, overlooking the Baltic Sea, dedicated to the submariners of both world wars. It is a simple stone column topped with an eagle, and at its base are bronze plaques listing names, thousands of them, engraved in small, cramped letters. On a gray afternoon in March, the wind from the sea is cold, and the plaques reflect nothing but sky. Visitors sometimes leave flowers, sometimes they leave small stones, in the old tradition. Occasionally, a very old man will stand before the monument for a long time, saying nothing, and then walk away. The monument does not mention hunter-killer groups or escort carriers. It does not speak of tactics or statistics. It simply says, "In memory of those who went to sea and did not return." This is the epilogue the U-boat men earned. Not glory, not vindication, but memory. They believed in something, whether it was duty or camaraderie or simply the hope of survival, and they went into the darkness knowing the odds. That requires a kind of courage, even in a lost cause, even in service to a regime that did not deserve their loyalty. But the ocean does not care about courage. It does not weigh causes or judge ideologies. It simply takes what it is given, steel and flesh, diesel and air, and transforms it into silence. The hunter-killer groups understood this. They were not instruments of justice or vengeance. They were instruments of reality, of industrial capacity, of technological integration, of the cold arithmetic of attrition. They proved that in modern war, production matters more than valor, systems matter more than individuals, and the side that can build faster will prevail. The escort carriers were symbols, floating monuments to a particular kind of power, the power of abundance, of organization, of relentless impersonal efficiency. They were not beautiful, they were not even particularly good ships by peacetime standards, but they were enough. They were more than enough. They were the answer to the question, what happens when limitless resources meet finite courage? The answer was written in the black water of the Atlantic, in the oil slicks and debris fields, in the silence after the breaking up noises, in the empty pens at Lorient and Bergen, in the lists of names on monuments overlooking cold seas. The hunters became the hunted, and the ocean kept its secrets. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.